Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Brilliant. Okay, so hello, Jose. This is how we start. And we'll get started properly now and hope that Nate turns up. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to RaC Guild 2026. Very excited to start the year with you all. There's a lot going on in the world, and a lot of it is about the rules-based order, funnily enough. So we're in the right time and in the right place to be having this conversation. And this morning, I'm really excited because I'm bringing two parts of my world together right now, the blockchain world and the rules of code world. I've been one of those crazy people that have been going that these two things need to come together. And this is the first opportunity to bring a whole bunch of colleagues and friends from the rules of code world together with the blockchain world right now. So I think we can do a lot of good together. And I couldn't think of anybody better to start this off than a couple of friends who are working with the rules in the blockchain world to try and start to explain a little bit about what we're doing over there so that maybe we can have some ongoing conversations this year about how these two worlds come together. And first person I could think of was somebody that participated in building a constitution, so a legal document for a global community in order to turn a blockchain over to its community to be run forevermore. That's the Cardano community. It's the Cardano blockchain, and one of our guests today is Jose, who comes to us from Bogota in Colombia. Jose and I met at the Constitutional Convention that happened at the end of 2025. So we met in person, but we've been talking online for a long time since then. And the other guest, fingers crossed he gets here, is Nate Suits, who's been working in an organisation called the Token Engineering Commons, which has been the centre of a lot of research and development work across the blockchain industry around how you use tokens in governance of systems. So hopefully Nate gets here, but if not, it doesn't matter anyway, because we've got one of the best people from the Cardano blockchain here, Jose. So, Jose, thank you very much for coming today. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, but also from your work on the Cardano Constitution, what does blockchain actually change about rules and authority and legitimacy, particularly in a decentralized system?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure being here. It's a real pleasure always being in contact with a dear part of that hemisphere, of that part of the world. I have a very dear memory of living there in that part of the world for a while when I was younger. So it's always great to reconnect. So maybe a little bit about myself. I'm a professional in business and economics. I developed my professional life for more than 20 years in the corporate world, top tier corporations, mostly in organizational design, HR, and the governance areas of the business. And it's been, this bug of blockchain bit me about 10 years ago. And first I was kind of curious, and then, it became a rabbit hole. I ended up, I'm not a technical person at all. I'm not a developer. I can't be code even. So I decided to kind of approach this ecosystem more from the governance side of things, and then organizational design where there's really a very fully organization. So which were the patterns that would work, which were the constraints, the risks, the attack areas that were vulnerable, etc. During that time, I switched my whole attention to this. I ultimately ended up connecting with the business school, and I became a blockchain for business professor here. And then I found, a few years down the road, I found Cardano. And I particularly like Cardano for a few reasons. One is that it was kind of the most serious effort that I was seeing in the ecosystem where they were really thinking about governance. And this is relevant because blockchain, you can have many understandings about blockchain, but one truth about blockchain is that the real value that it delivers is exponential reduction in cost for trusting. So it's not a matter of not trusting or not trusting. It's not that you're doing anything that you couldn't do before. You're just using a different tool to be able to do something that you already did in a better way, in a cheaper way. And that is trusting other people. When you have this blockchain technology and you have the immutability attributes and you have, the lack of centralization, there's no one who can actually viably modify the information that's on blockchain, and you're actually trusting the code, then you come to this. I understand you're all very aware of this. You come to a point in which you're not trusting human beings necessarily. You're trusting math, you're trusting code, you're trusting science, you're trusting something more tangible. And you're doing it in a much cheaper and faster way. The thing about having decentralization at the core of being able to produce this, because decentralization is really what drives the value here, is that you can't take decisions. You have the case of Bitcoin. They've been very hectic in their governance, and they have been struggling a little bit with making decisions. They haven't been able to advance much in their technology. Then you have other blockchains which have struggled in the other side. They are fast, they are cheap, and they're very centralized also. So there's always the risk that just a very small group of people could come together and take control or modify what's there in the blockchain. So how do you get to this balance where you can actually take decisions at the same time that you stay decentralized and you stay capable of being able to provide that trust? And that was this effort. So maybe 4 years ago, we started with developing this framework for governance. We came up with something that was, as we started trying to build something that was only code. And very quickly we started finding edge cases which were not solvable by code. So what happened is that we ended up having a hybrid system where you still have people in the loop. You have persons actually taking a good look at things and decisions, and you have a code layer that takes care of what code can take care of. We decided that we needed to build a rule book, and that rule book included both code and non-code things. It was a little bit difficult to do that. And then what we came to the conclusion is that providing rules for every single scenario in the world is impossible. So you need to design this rule book in a principle-based approach, not a rule-based approach. So when you're having principles that are clear, it's easier to be able to have a rule book that can adapt to those principles. And those principles shouldn't change much. So we call that a constitution, that principle book. And we ended up with a system that has a constitution that has kind of the higher power within the ecosystem, and there was a struggle because there were people who would say, the code is law, and then the constitution needs to be a side thing, or it even needs to be kind of on a second level below the code. And there was the other part of the group which would argue that you needed to have this constitution above everything else, and then the code would be evolving according to what was agreed on that constitution. That's ultimately what prevailed. So today we have is a constitution that has some principles. We call them tenets. And those tenets kind of provide the spirit of Cardano, what Cardano is about. So what can be done, but more importantly, cannot be done. So we try to, if we're gonna make a mistake, we will try to make a mistake in the side of freedom, right? So not constraining anyone too much. That's a very short part. And then it has a second part where it's a little bit more descriptive. And that's the part that humans are necessary, because that's not code. It's just law, right? It's just written text. That needs interpretation. So we have a constitutional committee, which is elected democratically, and has some sort of rules, and it's there's 7 seats, and each seat has between 1 and 7 people there. So it's roughly 50 people who are looking at the Constitution and at every initiative that comes by and say, okay, this fits what's being written in the Constitution, or it doesn't. And then you have another group which are called the DRS, which are kind of democratically elected representative of people, right, of the members of the community. And you also have the actual people who run the nodes. Blockchain needs nodes, whether it's miners or validators or SPOs or whatever you call them. It's actually the computers where the code is running, where the database is hosted. And some people argue, well, ultimately, if they take the decision of doing something and changing software, and they do it, they come together and do it, the Constitution doesn't matter. And they're right. They could do it. And it would definitely represent a break and a hard fork in the community more than in code. But then that wouldn't be called Cardano. That would be another community with kind of different thing. And that's one of the vulnerabilities that we still have. That's probably the strongest vulnerability that we have today, is that ultimately there's a group of people, fortunately it's large enough that we're not concerned about it, that could come together and overrule everything else. And that's the people who run the software. But the software does not account for anything. Ultimately, the only decision that they can take is implementing a different version of the software and running something that's different and ignoring everything that's been agreed before. That's a significant vulnerability, but then our best defense in that is, again, decentralization and the power of the numbers. Having a large number of validators is key. We have around 3,000 of those. About 1,000 are very active, and I would say that at least 200 need to come together to be able to take decisions. So we're not bulletproof, but we're safe enough. And there's a third part of the Constitution that we call guardrails, which is actually guardrails to the code. So there's parameters in the code that can be configured in certain ways that would be kind of dangerous. So what we wrote in the Constitution is these parameters need to meet these conditions. So whether it's a threshold that they need to achieve, or they cannot be changed more often than a certain speed, or they cannot be changed alone because they need to be changed in a block with other parameters to be able to counterbalance the risk. They cannot be changed. It has not been discussed thoroughly in the community, there's a certain amount of conditions, and the more risky those parameters are, the more threshold, the higher the threshold in voting for that decision to be able to be taken. So that's kind of the three parts of the Constitution. We have the principles or the tenets, the main text, and then those guardrails, which is basically constraints to what can be what can go and cannot go in the parameter in the codes. So that's a little bit of the history. We, as we mentioned, Joe mentioned, we met in December 2024 when the Constitution was ratified. It was a democratically thing. It was an exercise of 6 months of workshops around the world. About 20,000 people participated, and then people were elected to discuss what the end version of the Constitution. What I did is just participate in a working group for a couple of years to bring together the first draft, and then that was put out into the community, and the community ended up taking the decision what they wanted to include there. And that was ratified in Buenos Aires and Kenya about a year ago, a little bit more. I met Joe there, and ever since we've been connected in our research, or really our quest for better governance. And I would say that, just to close this part of the conversation, that the key has been, or the main challenge has been keeping people engaged. So you can have the numbers, you can have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, you can be decentralized, you can give them rights. But most people don't have the incentive to even bother to look at it, much less to vote. So this is one of many things that they have in their lives. We all have hectic lives and busy lives, and getting people to actually participate in governance is hard. Not all cultures give themselves permission or interest to participate in the common decisions, and the decisions of the commons. Many cultures are very hierarchical, very vertical, and they're used to not taking decisions. So getting them to even think or be aware that they can participate, and that ultimately ends up benefiting everyone, is hard. And in cultures where that is a common practice, people take it for granted and usually don't participate. So what you end up having is a very small group of people taking the very, very critical decisions without consulting the majority. So I guess what I'm saying here is keeping the legitimacy of the governance and legitimacy of the decisions is probably the hardest part of building governance for blockchain.
No kidding. I have to make I'm on one of the constitutional. I'm on one of the constitutional committees. So the constitutional committee that looks after the constitution has 7 seats, and one of those seats is run by a council that includes members from Australia and New Zealand, as well as Vietnam and Korea and Japan. And every time a decision comes from the community, because anybody can make a proposal, it's called a governance action or an info action. There are different kinds. Anybody can make a proposal to the whole community, and every time they do that, the Constitutional Committee compares that proposal against the Constitution and decides whether it's constitutional, alongside the vote by the decentralized representatives, which would be like members of parliament, potentially, kind of, ish. And anybody can become a DREP, and those are the ones that vote. So the parameters that run this common digital public infrastructure called a blockchain with the brand Cardano all of those pieces are literally, it's run through that process. So any proposal that comes to, for instance, make a treasury withdrawal. So over the years, the Cardano and its trading has built up a treasury, and that treasury is now available to the community to use. And any member of the community can make a proposal to use part of that treasury to do a particular project, but then all of the proposal needs to be judged against the Constitution first, and then the whole of Cardano's DRECs get to vote on whether that gets used or not. So there is some similarity to everything that we're doing in the rules of code world with governments, whether they be state governments or national governments. Key difference is everything is stored immutably on a ledger that anybody can look at any point in time, and anybody can make a proposal at any point in time. So there are differences and there are similarities, but the Constitution, the Constitutional Committee, and the DRECs are really the structure of the governance of this digital public infrastructure. One of the pieces of the Constitution that Jose was very involved in was the net change limit. So in the process of creating the Constitution, everybody realized one of those big risks, particularly Jose, is that some community member would turn up and go, right, okay, we're going to use all of the treasury to do this particular thing. How would we stop that in 1 year? So a parameter was put in place called a net change limit. Didn't end up exactly as it was originally intended, which is another story for another time, but that's one of the rules that was written into the Constitution. So nobody can put a proposal in for more than a certain amount that's defined by the net change limit. Might be going into too much detail, but I think it gives you some idea of the similarity between managing budgets for governments, agencies, ministries, policy initiatives, etc., and how we do it in the blockchain world compared to what happens in the real, let's say, the real world, traditional governance world. I think we have Nate with us. Is that right? Nate, are you there?
I am. Apologies for the late attendance and link mess up. Yeah.
It's all good. We've been having a few technical issues this morning. So, yeah, no, it's good to have you with us. Nate and Barry have never met each other either. So this is a great opportunity to bring people together. So Nate's been working in the Token Engineering Commons, which has been working with multiple blockchains, usually EVM-based, Ethereum-based blockchains, slightly different to Cardano and Bitcoin, which are a slightly different protocol. Yeah, exactly. But similar challenges and similar opportunities being explored. And you've been recently thinking about how blockchains can be used in public administration at a hyper-local level. So rather than the global level, really, really close to home. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, Nathan, and rules and tokens, how those two things go together.
Yeah, I mean, just to hop on real quick, just to comment on the last part of what Jose was talking about, legitimacy. And I think this is kind of an important concept for all governments, no matter the infrastructure that you build it on, is that, legitimacy at scale is less about who votes and who doesn't vote. And it's more about whether the decisions are, perceived as appropriate or accountable by those impacted. And so I do, believe governance research needs to start moving away from these kind of participation metrics and start to consider how legitimacy is gained or lost over time. And I think that's a big part of what governance is about and should be about moving forward. But yeah, I do think that the what we're studying here within things like DAO governance translate very nicely into the public sector. And so I have a framework called CitySync, which is basically an idea to shift, it's the intersection of blockchains and public administration on a local level. If we look at what our local governments are, they're a vehicle for coordination, and it's been the most convenient vehicle that we've ever created. It's a technology stack, if we want to look at it from that perspective. And what do? They help us solve coordination problems. And blockchains do the same thing with the trust minimized environment, create incentives for new social and communal behaviors to be enacted on a local level. And so the idea is that you can utilize what I've been calling decentralized public administration networks as a way to actually coordinate those same activities that are government agencies and the functions that they perform for us, and allow a this kind of politically neutral blockchain to actually facilitate those coordination on our behalf. And there are many instances where you can actually do that. And there are many instances where centralized execution of public administration functions makes sense. And so really figuring out exactly what types of functions do our local governments perform can be done through a decentralized network, and what functions are actually appropriate for centralized and technocratic experts to focus on, things that we rely on daily, big infrastructure projects, water, energy. These things are needed we need to have experts that are focusing on the execution of those things because we rely on it so importantly. But what is missing is that there's this technology that we have that can enable and empower more agency from our citizens and participation from our citizens that we don't necessarily get because we've been trained over decades to rely on government all the time. And when we see a piece of trash on the ground, we just go, man, our city is shitty at picking up this trash and cleaning up our city. But it's like, no, you go do it. Why aren't you doing it? We lack incentives, we lack rules, we lack the structure in order for us to participate because we relied on governments for so long to do these things for us. And so the idea is that if we can figure out these types of systems, coordination systems on the local level, we can actually scale that up and have intercity networks and interregional networks and state networks and so on and so forth. And so I do think that the primitives that we're really looking at here within DAO governance are extremely valuable to the way we treat our public sector. And instead of having these kind of civ tech companies who are just trying to make bureaucracy more efficient, we should be creating systems that empower citizens to become part of the process. And I think that we can start to look at, governance, not starting to look at them from like voting systems and things of that nature, but looking at governance outcomes. What kind of tool can we place here that will improve the outcomes that we're looking for? And so, yeah, just to give you a kind of a broad outline. Don't want to take up too much of the time.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thank you for the overview. So we've heard from Jose, so that there is an opportunity to lower the cost of coordination massively using blockchains. And there's an opportunity to increase participation in managing the commons of a community, whether that's a hyperlocal community or a state or a nation, a federal government. So there are opportunities here, which doesn't include the one that I'm most passionate about, which is owning your own data and having some kind of record of your interactions with systems that actually affect your life as a citizen. That's the reason that I'm interested in blockchain and that immutable record. So there are opportunities here for rules as code from local governments, state governments, national governments to be on the blockchain and to take advantage of some of these opportunities of lowering cost, increasing participation, getting your community engaged, getting people more involved in the decisions about how money is made. But it requires this bridge between the two. So I'm wondering, from what you've heard this morning, everybody in the room, what questions questions might you have for Nate and Jose? Go for it, Alfred. First hand up, didn't even have to ask. Can't hear you, Alfred.
Unmute.
It was awkward. How about now?
Yeah, perfect. We can
Cool. Speak for myself. I wanted to say firstly, thank you for both your talks and presentations. And I'm sorry that I'm off camera at the moment. But just a general question for you both. Have you got any examples of collaborations with or case studies with government at any level, whether it's federal, state, or local, that are experimenting, adopting, productionizing? Can you share some of those, if you have any? And if not, what do you see the barriers being?
Who wants to jump in?
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, no, I mean, I've seen many experiments all over the world, to be honest with you, in terms of just seeing how many people and how many governments are actually trying things out, which is great to see. The problem is, we have a lot of people who are doing these isolated experiments. They work it out for maybe a little bit and then they fizzle out. And a big part of that is because we don't have a shared infrastructure for those efforts. Even here in Oakland, California, we tried to launch a community currency experiment just to see how people would do with at farmers markets and things like that, how they would participate if they'd come back. We also had a bond experiment that was launched on Avalanche Chain. We had a bunch of different ones here in the city of Oakland, and the problem is that you might get a couple of participants, but there's nothing bringing them back to the table because they're all operating on different chains, all operating on different style of networks and user flows. And so what ends up happening is that they go, man, I don't want to have to go through all these different avenues, and the UX is terrible. And so they just say, I'm not coming back. And that's a huge problem. If we can figure out a way to actually get these all on the same substrate and have a common language and a common place to go back to, I think these types of experiments would happen, would find a little bit more data and a little bit more engagement than they currently do. And then the other part is that we're not sharing these findings with each other. I'm really hoping that we can find Open Civics on Ethereum is starting to try to do that. They're trying to aggregate some of these case studies that are happening all over the place. But we need to be better at sharing this information, sharing these findings to help with the implementation processes that we seek to do. Yeah.
Two comments on that, Nate. Just one, it's an awkward tension I feel between your the approach you're taking around bottom up and scaling up rather than scaling down, and the opposing intention around having common infrastructure, because who takes the bill and who's incentivized to create the common infrastructure for all to use? So it's an interesting tension there. The second comment, just fun fact, I spent 8 months of my life in working in Emeryville back in the .com boom. So I just thought I'd share that random fact with you since you mentioned Oakland. Yeah,
big area.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that tension is really important to address too, and that's why in the framework that I proposed, it's the idea of using local chains where you have known institutions as validators of these local chains and completely having these gasless chains where you can experiment in the user experience. They don't even know they're interacting with a blockchain. Like I said, the point of this is not decentralization. The point of this is to institutionalize new types of behaviors as well as create new types of communal behaviors around shared objectives. And there's a degree of distribution, like distributed governance that you can have for that. But it's just one of those things where I think the cost of it, if we can drive the cost down, especially with open source, and we can start to create these programs or applications around public administration, you can create a marketplace, an open source marketplace, where you now have cities that are exporting civic models to one another, rather than just having this isolated top down from the federal government to execute.
Just before Jaden jumps in with his next question, Jose, did you have anything to add from the Cardano perspective around that common substrate?
Yeah. So my reflection is more on not specifically within Cardano governance, about the effect of actually, what's the contribution of blockchain within this whole framework governance framework transformation, right? So it's very easy for incumbents to hype and overhype what the contribution of the blockchain would be. And really, it comes down to, yes, of course, there's internal governance and there's learnings from that. But governance in the world has many different approaches, and many of them have been evolving for centuries, and they're accustomed to that culture. So there's no point in underestimating that. Blockchain, what really brings to the table is a high degree of trust at a very low cost. And that's it. That's everything that blockchain is bringing to the table. So, the rules, and that's something that has been the experience. So when you approach governments or institutions and you say, well, you should automate this rules so that you're more efficient and more fair and you reduce corruption and whatever. What blockchain is able to do is just say, whatever you define in those rule books is what's going to happen. And there's no middleman. There's no in between. There's no dark hand that will be able to manipulate that, as there is right now in every single political system in the world. There's always money under the table. There's always the friend. There's always the favor. There's always the mistake. And what blockchain brings to the table is just that, more transparency and more efficiency and more trust. But whatever you put in the rule book, what the rules are and how you build those rules, that's a completely different conversation. It's more the traditional conversation on, should it be permissionless? Should it be more inclusive? Should it be more participatory? Should it be more technically focused? Should it be, defined by the people who are impacted by the effects of those rules? How do you do that architecture is completely different, a completely different topic of you building on blockchain or using blockchain to be able to provide more trust or not. Those problems have been there and will continue to be there for a while, I imagine.
Thank you, and thank you for defining and great to have the conversation and not have anybody talk about crypto. We're talking about blockchain. Thank God we are talking about infrastructure. Jaden, your question.
Thank you, Jose and Nathan, for the talk. That was really interesting. It's the first time I've really heard about blockchain in terms of governance, because I've heard of blockchain in terms of the financial sector, housing, health, and also crypto. But this is really refreshing to hear. Just on Alpha's point before around a kind of how do you encourage people? Because in Australia, we had the rollout of 5G, which is the network infrastructure. There's late mover advantage, where the first people to start, you get no benefit. There's zero benefit to adopting it because no one's using it. And then there's an exponential curve as to the more people adopt this, the further you go down the line, people want to adopt it because everyone else is using it. And so the people at the end of the line, it's a no-brainer for them to adopt this kind of technology. So how do you incentivize, how do you encourage governments, institutions to move to this digital public infrastructure?
Okay, maybe I'll have a couple of ideas here, and maybe jump in and then complement. I'd say that there's a lot of barriers and a lot of friction. Governments and institutions naturally tend to do the things in the same way they've done it in the past. So usually you get the most resistance from people within the system, or people who are already operating it. And the incentive is usually making them part of the change. Like I don't know if you have the same name everywhere else, but in most of America we have notaries, right? So people who validate transactions and kind of the trust certificators, the truth certificators, sorry, for big decisions, for contracts, for property registries, etc. And being the ultimate depositaries of truth of the society, they are the ones who are resisting the most. But there has been a very successful exercise in which they are the ones who are actually building on this infrastructure and being able to make it more profitable and make it more, so it's a business for them. They're not public servants. They have public delegation of authority, but they are businesses. And I think that it always comes down to having the right incentive framework, and having something on the table for the people who are doing it, the changes, and who are actually doing the current, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the word exactly, it's the incumbents. The incumbents, they need to have a reason to change. And it could be punitive, it could be censorship, it could be, don't do it, it's a rule, and there's a public punishment, whether it's by law or by social critique, if you will, or there could be a market incentive. And usually those market incentives work a lot better.
Yeah. So I would say that the problem is not a technical problem. It's an institutional one. I mean, we have these institutions that are not, they're not designed for optimizing innovation. They're optimized for managing risk. And so, the first thing that we have to do is change our language, about this. This is not trying to innovate on government systems. We're trying to minimize risk and start to speak the language of these institutions and saying, hey, look, you've had these IT legacy systems, even though they've been completely at risk for a long time, because you're afraid to change, because a leader in position holds more risk by changing a system and failing than they do just maintaining its old system that has been, a huge burden on the system for a long time. And so there's this kind of natural incentive to say, let's just keep the status quo and keep moving forward, because I'm not taking that risk as a personal public official. So we have to start really speaking about, how do we say this system that I'm proposing is reducing the risk of this legacy IT system that you have by introducing new forms of participation and engagement. And then that applies to procurement, all of these different technical aspects of what governments use. Because the truth is, most of these are written in COBOL, what happens when the last, programmer retires and they can't, there's nobody to maintain those systems. And so when you look at it, there's a huge amount of risk, especially in public administration, but innovation, the word innovation is often, treated as a red flag or something to be scared of. And that's just something that we really have to change and start to change our language around, because I do think that a lot of these public officials are willing to, a lot of the cities within the United States, at least, they're in over their heads. They have a lot of debt. They have a lot of structural problems. And they need to reduce costs in terms of the employment. They need to engage citizens more and get more people participating in public functions. And the only way we can do that is to say, hey, let's speak their language. Let's talk about the value propositions that mean something to them, and say, hey, we can solve that for you, and here's the solution. Rather than saying, why don't you innovate? Why don't you try to get this done, and it just puts up, big brick walls in front of them that they can't navigate. And so I do think that's the biggest challenge, to be honest with you, is just changing our language around it.
I totally agree with the language part. I think in Australia, at least, we have a lot of outdated terms, and our public service was built around the Industrial Revolution. We have a term called long service leave for public servants, and that was originally in Australia, the long service is you go back to the colony, which is the UK, and you go on a ship and you travel back and you see your family, and then you come back. And we still have that. We still have this kind of thing. So I think, changing the language around the risk, and sometimes, innovation is good, but I think a lot of governments see innovation as costly, and they see it as not actually making meaningful change, because similar to what you were talking about, Nathan, with all these small clusters of innovation that are happening with blockchain, it's the same thing with rules as code, where there's people experimenting with rules as code in a lot of different areas, but there isn't a common platform to be able to share this and to be able to understand what is everyone else doing here, because otherwise we're just doing the same thing over and over again. just on the immutability aspect of blockchain, I think this is really fascinating for keeping everything out in the open and all this kind of thing. But when you bring this into the public service, or you bring this into governance, I feel like there's a risk here, like a legal risk, because governments correct things, governments do retroactive changes, governments have reforms, governments change policy all the time, and there may be something into the immutable ledger that is incorrect, or it is correct at the time, and then it is democratically changed later on. And then that would need to be updated. So how would that be possible, and how do you manage rule or policy changes in the blockchain?
I mean, I don't know, Jose, I don't know too much about, Cardano or anything, but, it's very hard when you have this immutability characteristic, because I do think that if you're building governance systems for the public sector right now, you have to really focus on reversibility. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking that they're going to create this static monolithic structure and that it's going to stay that way forever. We even make this mistakes within DAOs, because we have this structure and we say this is the perfect governance system, and all of a sudden the demographics come in and out and flow, mobility is prioritized, so people just come through and the demographics change, the incentives change, and all of a sudden that perfect governance system that you built needs to evolve and you're unable to do it. So I do think that reversibility is one of those things that have to be kind of a strong principle when designing these types of systems, because you need to be able to reclaim or correct course if things go off of the intended path. And so when you're starting off with a governance structure, you need to be able to evolve it early on and really narrow the functions that you're implementing, instead of having this like, let's all transform it all at once, but let's slowly kind of test out these assumptions that we've made within this governance system, and be able to stop, pause, reclaim, have deliberations. And if you do that and you do it publicly, it does bring legitimacy over time, because you have this open dialogue of saying, we're trying things out, we want to experiment, this is what went wrong, we need to change it, this is why, what do you guys think, let's put this in perspective. And so I do think that's a huge thing that needs to be addressed when trying to build these into systems that impact people's direct lives.
Jose.
Yeah. So we approach this as amendability management. So we don't speak about reversing decisions, but amending them. And there's a big difference. It's you never erase what you did. You leave it there, and then you change. You have a new version. And that amendability is, was key. We're just trying the good balance. And I'm not sure that we have the right balance yet, but you need to make changes to be made, but you still need it to be robust enough and be permanent enough so that you provide stability to that ecosystem that you're governing. Because actually one of those, not all the ecosystems need the same level of stability or rule stability, but if you're talking about governments at any level, you need some sort of stable rule book so that people can actually invest and get rules and get decisions in their lives and not be wondering of when this is going to change. So we provided different levels of amendability according to different levels of impact. So as I mentioned in the guardrails, some of the parameters are more dangerous than others. So those need, if you change them, first, when you propose that change, you need to provide as part, as a constitutional requirement, you need to provide a correction path if that doesn't work out as you intended. So as part of the proposal, you need to provide an exit plan. 1, 2, if you change it, you cannot change it in a certain period of time. So it cannot change before 6 months or before a year, or before a couple of years, that can change. And the third variable is the thresholds that need to be reached in the voting. So some parameters can be changed very easily, 50, a simple majority, 50% plus 1, and that's it. And others, you need 90%, 75%, 60%. And that's how can you manage it? Because you need you provide something that is not amendable, and it's not changeable, it's irreversible. And there's the conditions change. What ends up happening is that you have a coup. People will just leave it and create a new one, and that's when you have revolutions, and that's where you have society hard forks. So that's definitely part of the design, and striking the right balance is very difficult because you can't do it as a one rule fits all. Every variable needs its own amendability parameters.
Did that cover your question, James?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I want to add another aspect to it, which is going back to the original point of Jose, which is the trust factor. In our current political environment, who trusts what the government says? All right? Who trusts what the data actually is? Where is the root of trust? Where is the record? The memory of what's happened that can't be changed is a very useful tool in order to be able to anchor that trust. There is no society that really grows without its memory and without its elders. You could treat blockchain as the elder. Here is our history of our society. That's certainly one of the ways that I look at the Cardano Constitution. Because at the end of the day, what you want to build is a commons, right? Is something, a community that looks after each other and the assets and the potential of that community. So yeah, if you're not holding on to all of the decisions that all of your community made previously, it's really hard to get that kind of community participation, people actually being involved in making this commons better, whatever this commons is. And in this case, it's digital public infrastructure that is not ruled by any particular government. So I want to lob one in that a question in that I didn't prepare for Nate or Jose, but comes off this, which is, do you think that AI is now going to accelerate the use of blockchain, specifically because of those immutability capabilities that it provides? There you go.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I don't know if it's for the immutability purposes. I just think AI needs some rails to work on if it's going to interact in a trustful manner. But it's a whole nother realm.